Hey, anyways, again, my name's Stefan. I'm the campus pastor here in Denver. Before we dive in today, I want to give you a little context about something I'm going to talk about. If you're new today, our lead pastor, his name's Jim Bergen. He kind of functions as the CEO of our church. He's on sabbatical. Sabbatical is just kind of a churchy word for extended rest. And so we're actually going to hear from Jim today, and I'm going to reference that a couple times today. So I just want to give you a little context so we're all working with the same information today. So quick story before I dive in. I shared with you a couple weeks ago, I got to hang out with Jim. We're going hunting. I'm an aspiring hunting. You can tell all my camo, I really fit the bill. Jim is an avid hunter. And so anyways, I got to hang out with him, and maybe it was an overshare, but I shared with him that like, hey, I'm teaching on rest today. And he just looks at me and all confused, and he says, Stefan, you don't know anything about rest. And I was kind of offended. I was like, that's really easy to say from the guy who's on a 6-month sabbatical, like, come on, jerk, like I didn't say that to him, but I certainly thought it. But full transparency, I don't know if I've ever preached on anything that I'm wrestling so much with personally. And I'll share more about that with you guys in a bit. And again, you're gonna hear from Jim today, so I'm just gonna dive in so that we can honestly get to that. Great setup today. I open, Jim closes, not a bad gig. So if you weren't here last week, Ben kicked us off in a new series called Burnout. And the series was intentional with that time of year. Again, summer's over, fall's starting, all of our fall routines are back. It's kind of that rush or this really busy season until the holidays. And so we wanted to just intentionally challenge and look at and talk about, hey, what's God say about resting and where's he present in such a busy season? And so instead of trying to recap everything that Ben said, I just cut out a little clip of Ben talking about burnout. We're gonna check that out so we're all working on the same stuff today. So check this out real quick.
And I know I'm not the only one in the room who's been through a season where you go, this is killing me, right? Some of us have been there and done that. Others of us were there right now. And the name for that feeling that you get is burnout. Anytime that you're like, man, this is physically, spiritually, like emotionally killing me, that's called burnout. Burnout's actually a very real deal in our nation right now. Some of you might know this because you're in the medical field, but the term burnout has now been included in the medical dictionary, like right there with bone fracture and the flu, right? And the medical definition of burnout is this: it's an exhaustion of physical or emotional strength, usually as a result of prolonged stress or frustration. It's in the dictionary now. The reason it's in the medical dictionary now is because burnout now accounts for an estimated $190 billion in healthcare spending every single year in America. It's been proven that burnout leads to type 2 diabetes, coronary heart disease, depression, high cholesterol, just to name a few. And according to a recent study by Gallup, the study said that 50% of America, half of this room, feels burned out multiple times a year. And according to the study, 1/4 of this room, 1 out of every 4 of us, we feel burned out every single day of our lives, every day. It's just the facts, it's the statistics. We are a nation of physically, emotionally, spiritually exhausted people, and it's making us feel sick and detached and purposeless and depressed, and it's robbing us of our lives. For a lot of us metaphorically, for some of us, sadly, literally.
So I actually have a weird fascination of tracking and reading about a lot of statistics about the health of our society and our culture. And I'd heard of some of that before, but when Ben said that out loud, it's just staggering to me. Thinking that over half of this room is burned out or will be at some point this year, and that 25% of us every day feel that we're burned out. And the truth was, that was so convicting for me, is I would actually personally put myself in that 25%. Now, when Ben was talking, I was also reminded of a study that the insurance company Cigna published last year. I'm guessing some of you guys saw this, but they published a study on loneliness in the United States. And I think that's very closely intertwined with this idea of burnout, is this idea of isolation. And here's some of the statistics that Cigna published. They published that 50% of Americans report feeling alone or left out every year. 25% feel as if no one in their life understands them. 40% of us feel as if our relationships are not meaningful, and 50% of Americans don't feel as if they have a meaningful social interaction on a daily basis. And I also just think this is important to note, but this study only looked at people over 18. And Gen Z right now is just about everybody in kindergarten up to about 22 years old. And so those that they pulled from about 18 to 22 actually reported that they are the most unhealthy and most loneliest generation of anybody in America. And honestly, that's just mind-blowing to me. It's mind-blowing to me that burnout has become a medical term. Cigna would argue that we have an epidemic of loneliness in our country, which is just weird when you think about how connected we all are. But God has a lot to say about this. And here were some of Ben's main takeaways from last week. Ben introduced us to this idea of Sabbath, which is a purposeful, intentional day of rest. And God had outlined that for us in two different ways. First, he modeled this when on the seventh day of creation, he rested. And that's really important to note because whether or not you feel like you're burned out right now, God rested when everything was still perfect. And so there's this intention to connect with him behind rest. And second, Ben reminded us that one of the first 10 commandments, one of the first laws that God presents to mankind is to rest. So there's don't murder, don't steal, and rest. So it must have been important if those were one of God's first messages and laws to us. And so Ben asked this question last week. He said, how might Sabbath, a day of rest, be good for us? And his answer was, for the love of God, we rest to enjoy our life. For the love of God, enjoy your life as a form of praise and thanks for what God has provided to you. Now, if you're like me, last week when I'm sitting there and I'm hearing all these statistics, I just got really discouraged. And then honestly, anytime God models something, that's hard for me to connect with because it's God, because we aren't God, we're humans. And like Ben talked about, the need for us to rest among the chaos of our day-to-day lives is a very real thing that God knew that we would need. And so with all that being said, my hope for you today, whether you connect with this personally or not, is that you're just reminded that God has designed and cares very deeply for our very basic, fundamental human needs. And so this idea of avoiding burnout is a very loving God, recognizing that when we are tired, exhausted, and lonely, we have the greatest potential to drift very far from him. And I don't know about you guys, but when I'm very far from God, the chances that I blow up my life absolutely skyrocket. So today I want us to focus on another reason that we believe rest is really important. And it's this idea. It's very simple. We rest with God. We rest to connect with God and to prepare to step back into the craziness of the world around us. And there's this great story of a very famous prophet named Elijah that we're going to look at today. And I hope it will emphasize just how much God cares about our humanity, but it's also going to help us really drive home that we have this need to connect with God. So we're going to be in the Old Testament today. The story of Elijah can be found in the book of 1 Kings. And to give you some context before we start, Elijah was a prophet, and that simply meant that God had intentionally picked him out with a very intentional message to bring to his people. And Elijah is described in the Bible as really of nobody importance. We don't really know where he came from when he shows up in the Bible. There's really no backstory to him, so he's just an average Joe. But he shows up in this time in Israel when there's been this terrible run of kings. And King Ahab and his wife Jezebel are on the throne now. And the Bible describes King Ahab as the most evil of any of his predecessors. And this is just a side note. I've never connected this in my life. So here's my ADD for you. My best friend's dad in high school, when we would go out, used to tell us not to bring any Jezebels home. And I never had any idea what he was talking about. And then it literally just dawned on me that he was like, hey, anybody that would marry King Ahab's probably not somebody you want to bring home to mom. So anyway, side note, during my intense studying of this passage. But what's important to me, or what I want to note, is that during Ahab's rule, many people worshiped a god named Bale. And even some of those people that worshiped Bale, they still worshiped God. And Bale was worshiped for a lot of things, but he was definitely a storm god. And now Elijah's been on this mission essentially to get rid of that idolatry, to get rid of that worship of Baal. And so Elijah gets a meeting with Ahab and Jezebel, and he essentially proclaims that, hey, for the next few years, there's not going to be any rain. And as you might imagine, rain back in the day especially just wreaked havoc on their society. And so as Elijah proclaimed, it stops raining for 3 years. And then in one of seriously the most epic showdowns in Bible history, Elijah meets the prophets of Baal on top of a mountain, and Elijah challenges these prophets to have Baal call down fire and light this burnt offering on fire. But of course, you know, Baal has no power, he can't do it. And so Elijah calls on his God, the God of Yahweh and the Christian God, and he calls down fire from heaven. And after this, very famous another part of this story is that Elijah has those 450 prophets of Baal slaughtered. And I won't lie, when I was thinking about this, I just went to Braveheart, but like way cooler. And I know they're remaking all these movies right now. I want to see Mel Gibson as Elijah. So I'm just throwing that out there. But after this moment, God eventually restores the rain, proving that he's the only God. And so now, even though Ahab has essentially been ruined, old Jezebel, she's pissed. And that's where we're going to pick up the story. This is 1 Kings chapter 19. And this is verse 1. It says, when Ahab got home, he told Jezebel everything Elijah had done, including the way he had killed all the prophets of Baal. So Jezebel sent this message to Elijah, may the gods strike me and even kill me if by this time tomorrow I have not killed you just as you killed them. Now, when I was first reading this, I was thinking, how would you have expected Elijah to respond to this kind of death threat? He just called down fire from heaven. The Bible uses the word slaughtered. He had just slaughtered these prophets of Baal. He had also raised a boy from the dead. And ever since he called this rain to stop, the king and queen have been wanting him to die for a couple years. So, personally, I think his response is, he's going to start talking some trash a little bit, but that's not what Elijah does at all. Verse 3, Elijah was afraid and fled for his life. He went to Beersheba, a town in Judah, and he left his servant there. Then he went on alone into the wilderness, traveling all day. He sat down under a solitary broom tree and prayed that he might die. I've had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life, for I am no better than my ancestors who have already died. So what's changed? How does he go from calling down fire from heaven to being on the run, to being afraid, to the point that he wants to die? And I want to look at that definition that Ben mentioned from the medical dictionary of burnout again. And it says burnout, an exhaustion of physical or emotional strength, usually as a result of prolonged stress or frustration. So now, I don't know about your experiences being a Christian and following Jesus, but it can be tiring. And if you're new to church, you might ask yourself, how can you be? Isn't that the pitch? That following Jesus is going to make my life easier? And my response is, of course, yes. Because for those of us that have been following God, we know that we have this new source of life. We have the Holy Spirit to lean on. But that doesn't mean that life changes. Life is hard, whether you're a prophet, whether you live today. We all know this, right? And while I don't think the call in our lives is comparable to that of Elijah's, I don't want us to forget or to diminish the call and responsibilities that God's given to us. And we haven't been asked to challenge the king, but I've been tasked with raising twins. And for the love of God, I would trade spots with Elijah before I go home today. They're absolutely nuts right now. Seriously though, I don't want us to lose sight of the importance of the missions and responsibilities that God has for us. Raising your kids, working, running that company that you own, going to college, putting a roof over your head. Those are all very real and important things that God has entrusted to us. And we have to do that all while dealing with things like depression and anxiety and loneliness and cancer and death and disease and divorce, and the list goes on. So we shouldn't be surprised when we find out that we're burned out. And I want to look at how Elijah responds when he feels this way. It says in verse 5, then he lay down and slept under the broom tree. But as he was sleeping, an angel touched him and told him, get up and eat. He looked around, and there beside his head was some bread baked on hot stones and a jar of water. So he ate and drank and lay down again. Then the angel of the Lord came again and touched him and said, get up and eat some more, or the journey ahead will be too much for you. So he got up and ate and drank, and the food gave him enough strength to travel for 40 days and 40 nights to Mount Sinai, the mountain of God. There he came to a cave where he spent the night. And I love these verses because they just reflect how much God acknowledges our humanity. Because what's the very first thing that God does for Elijah is he gives him an opportunity to sleep and to eat. And if you're taking notes today, I think that's a good place to start. We can't possibly connect with God and function in our day-to-day lives if we're not taking care of our physical health, starting with the most basic needs of sleep and eating well. And back to Cigna for a minute, they actually support this idea. They write in their report, they report that those who say they sleep just the right amount have lower loneliness scores, falling 4 points behind those who sleep less than desired, 7.5 points behind those who sleep more than they desired. They're significantly less likely to feel as though they lack companionship and are significantly more likely to feel like they have someone they can turn to. Just simple sleep can change our entire perspective on how we connect with people around us. So it's clearly going to help us connect better with God. So again, step one, leveraging rest for preparation is to make sure that you're sleeping enough and have the proper fuel to give you energy. But we can't overlook this. After God has fed and energized Elijah, he doesn't throw him back into the fight. Instead, his next assignment in his life is 40 days and 40 nights away. And from personal experience, I'm sure you guys agree with me, I've always been a big believer that God often uses time as a great way to heal our mind and to heal our hearts. Because when we separate and just set out that intentional time for the Lord, we know he can restore us physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. But as we're about to find out, not even food, sleep, a 40-day sabbatical will fix all this tension that Elijah has in his life. So let's see what happens next. This is verse 9. There he came to a cave where he spent the night. But the Lord said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Elijah replied, "I have zealously served the Lord God Almighty, but the people of Israel have broken their covenant with you, torn down your altars, and killed every one of your prophets. I am the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too." So God just gets him back on his feet, and what's Elijah do? And he does what I think a lot of us do if we're being honest when we're burned out. We point our finger back at God. Elijah reminds God that he's zealously been serving him, and by no fault of his own, while he's doing God's work, he finds himself running for his life. But I'm going to go out on a whim and say that Elijah's not the only one that's ever had that conversation with God. I know for me personally, I can't tell you how many times, especially during my marriage, when my wife and I were struggling with fertility, where we looked at God and I just berated God. I was mad at him for allowing my wife and I to suffer. And as a pastor, honestly, there's been plenty of times where I've been mad at God on your behalf. I'll meet with some of you who I absolutely just adore. And my view is that you're giving your entire life to God, but still the bills aren't getting paid. That diagnosis hasn't changed. She's still filing. That person is still fighting addiction. And I'm going to put myself in your shoes for a second. And I might be standing up here, but I promise I'm sitting right there with you when it comes to this idea. But what's really challenging to me when I think about all this is I don't think Jezebel was really the problem, this death threat that Elijah was running from. And when I think about it, I'm not sure my circumstances were ever really my problem either. And it's hard to say this, but as I reflect over the last several years of my life, I think it's possible that burnout was a major contributor to the grief and sorrow and stress that I felt. Because here's the truth, Elijah had seen God's faithfulness in his life, and he knew that God loved him. And I know all that stuff too. Yet still, among some of my most trying circumstances, when I reach those burnout levels of exhaustion, I'm like, God, where are you? But what's God's response to this? And I think, man, it's powerful. This is verse 11. See what he does with Elijah. He tells Elijah, "Go out and stand before me on the mountain." The Lord told him, and as Elijah stood there, the Lord passed by. And as a mighty windstorm hit the mountain, it was such a terrible blast that the rocks were torn loose, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, there was fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, there was the sound of a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Mighty windstorms, earthquakes, fires. You know what all that stuff sounds like to me? That sounds like finding out he just filed for divorce. Sounds like checking your bank account balance and there's negative numbers. Sounds like the doctor calling you to tell you that treatment failed again. And listen, here's what I want you to take from that though. God isn't interested in competing with the chaos of our lives. He's just not. Instead, after the chaos, Elijah hears that gentle whisper and he responds to it to find God ready to speak to him again. And my study Bible had this note that says a gentle whisper translates to a thin silence. And I know some of you guys have experienced that, but can you remember ever just feeling that slightly calming breeze when you're stressed out, you're sitting on your front porch and just knowing or feeling like, hey, in that moment that God's right there with you. And I want us to really capture that. God reveals himself in quietness because he just won't compete with the chaos of our lives. Now, I'm not going to put the verses up there, but you would think that after Elijah has this God moment that he would respond differently when God speaks to him. But Elijah just repeats himself and again reminds God, hey, God, I've been doing your work. I've been serving your people, and still somebody's trying to kill me. So food, sleep, a 40-day sabbatical. Now God has presented himself in this gentle whisper, and Elijah is still burned out. So God gives him exactly what he needs. Let's look at how this passage ends. This is verse 15. Then the Lord told him, go back the same way you came and travel to the wilderness of Damascus. When you arrive there, anoint Hazael to be king of Aram. Then anoint Jehu, grandson of Nimshi, to be king of Israel, and anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, from the town of Abel-Mohala, to replace you as my prophet. Anyone who escapes from Hazael will be killed by Jehu, and those who escape Jehu will be killed by Elisha. Yet I will preserve 7,000 others in Israel who have never bowed down to Bale or kissed him. Full disclosure, I rehearsed saying those words more than I did this talk. I'm like so proud of myself that I just got through that. But I had summarized those verses simply to say that God reminds Elijah that he doesn't have to do this alone. In fact, for this season, God is about to hand the baton to someone else. Now, that's exactly what Elijah needed, but I think we can learn from that. And I want to take a moment about how God revealed to me what I think I needed in this season. And I've shared this before, but over the last 12 months, I've been in pretty intensive counseling therapy, whatever you want to call it, but I specifically see a trauma therapist that focuses on eating addiction. That's a big part of my story. And I don't know about you guys, for those of you that have been in therapy or counseling, I usually spend about the first 45 minutes of my session trying to figure out what the counselor's getting at so I can outsmart her, you know? And then maybe the last 10 or 15 minutes when I finally kind of submit that she's smarter than me, maybe I get something out of it. But she knows this about me, and so this particular day, it's not an epiphany by any means, but definitely a pretty strong aha moment. I walk in, and before I can even start to think and relax, she just has this big bucket of balls on the table, tennis balls, ping pong balls, bouncy balls, cush balls, whatever. And she says, hey, just pick one that represents you. And then she says, I want you to tell me the 5 or 6, 7 biggest things that stress you out, and we're going to attribute them to some of these other balls. And so I'm like, well, my wife's pregnant. I'm always worried about that. You know, I've got these crazy twins. I have an adopted 20-year-old son who's trying to get in the military. My house flooded, my finances, work. And then if she would have had a bowling ball, I would have picked the bowling ball to represent my physical health. And so before I know it, I assign all these things, and she just picks them up and just starts throwing them at me. And I have to put my ball down to catch them. And she says in a moment, she says, Stefan, I want you to just kind of take this in. She said, I would bet that this is why you have gotten to this point in your life. She says that you are so scared to look at yourself in the mirror and to care for yourself first, that instead you put energy into all these other things in your life first. And that's just, it's going to lead to where you're at. It's going to lead to burnout. And so after the last couple months, I've been processing this, and I've taken a couple things away from it. And first, the really convicting one is when I put all these things out in front of me that are really stressing me out, I don't put God. I don't put this worry about I'm not in Scripture enough, I'm not praying enough, I'm not serving enough, I'm not tithing enough. It's nowhere to be found in the big concerns of my life. And the other big realization that I had, honestly, clinically, I've got a lot that's going on that's brought me to this point in my life. But my counselor's point is that as a husband, father, pastor, none of these things are ever going to change until I start caring for myself. And that gets more convicting when I run that through a Christian filter, because the truth is that approaching my life like this without Jesus is always going to lead to burnout until I figure out how to rest with God. Because again, resting in the Lord is the only thing that connects me to a source of life that will actually hold me up and will actually sustain me. And just like Elijah until recently, I've spent a lot of energy wondering where God is among all these storms in my life. And again, this is my story, but I think to some degree it represents a lot of our stories, that God gets the leftovers in our life. God is no bigger than a marble if she would have had a marble in that bag. So if you happen to be like me and Elijah and you're in this season, or maybe you're coming up on this season, I want to give you a couple things that I hope can help you just avoid burnout altogether. And then if you're in the thick of it, I hope this can just give you a couple steps to start moving out of it. And first, this is the biggest thing that I've learned when it comes to this idea of rest, is that we need a plan. Rest cannot be reactive. When we react to rest, that typically happens, or the need for rest, that typically happens when we are responding to exhaustion. So my challenge to all of you would be to honestly take a real assessment of your life. And here's a few things to run that through. First is, do you feel close to God? And it seems super churchy to say, but if God's getting the leftovers in our day-to-day, week-to-week lives, then we have to take a hard look at that. And let's go back to what Ben said last week. Let's just work on adding a Sabbath in there. And I get it. Maybe you guys felt this way last week. When Ben's talking about giving a whole day to your Sabbath, I'm like, no way, dude, not a chance. And this is the truth. One of the things that I'm kind of accountable, that I check into my counselor with every week, is she's trying to challenge me every day to just take 5 minutes. And she wants me to turn my phone off, not to be in front of the computer. And I'm trying to take that and pray. And I'll be honest, it's extremely difficult for me. So let's crawl before we walk. Let's walk before we run. If you don't have a Sabbath worked into your life yet, why don't we start with 15 minutes a day, an hour a week, whatever. And then let's prioritize that. Let's sell out to that the same way we will sell out to all the other important things in our life and make sure that it happens. And I want you guys to remember, like Ben said, that doesn't have to be like this hour of awkward prayer time. I can barely pray for 5 minutes. An hour would drive me nuts. But like Ben talked about, there's a lot of things that we can do to show God that we're praising him in our rest. I know a lot of us like to hike. Why don't you take a hike, but its sole intent is because you want to spend time with God? It sounds kind of silly, but maybe you love animals. So go to the zoo, again, with the intent to spend time with God. So that doesn't mean, again, you've just got to be praying and doing all these weird spiritual things, but let's just carve out that intentional time for God. That has to be step one. Let's make that plan. Second, what we learned from Elijah is that we have to assess our physical and mental health. It's just proof. You guys will know this better than me personally, but it might be time to finally call that counselor. It might be time to address that thing that we've been saying was just a season, but again, that season's been a decade. And if you're new, you might not know this, but Flatirons has an entire department of what we call care pastors. Their sole job is to connect with you and then to find a good, vetted, solid Christian counselor out in the community to connect you with. And so they would love to meet with you. Flatirons also has an entire department that we just call spiritual formation, and they focus on really intensive retreats and groups to kind of give you an opportunity to really kind of wrestle with God, if you will. And we talk about that a lot. We call that Crucible or soul groups. Those are both for men and women. Lots of opportunities there. And you can find out information about the counselors and the spiritual formation stuff all online. But I honestly think that it's worth thinking about. And then second, again, this might seem a little churchy, but who's speaking into your life? And another huge takeaway that we have from Elijah is that he was alone. Back in verse 3, it told us that he sent his servant away. And so this was a huge undertaking for him to do all this for the Lord. Yet we just found out, God just told him, hey, there were 7,000 other people that might have done this with you. But yet Elijah carried that burden by himself. So again, this might seem really juvenile, but who are you letting speak into your life? And this is what I mean. If you're having marriage problems, who have you reached out to support you? If you're struggling with anxiety and depression, who have you told and confided in for help? You're stressed to the max about finances, who have you asked to counsel you? Now, the reason that I mentioned that loneliness study again was because this idea of isolation and burnout, they go hand in hand. Because I think it's our nature when we get stressed out to take this posture that says, I can figure this out, I can get through this by myself. But I don't think we can really, and I'm not judging, I'm just standing here saying me too. But honestly, the reason that I've been counseling is because a year ago, almost to the day, I walked into Jim's office and said, Jim, my marriage is on the rocks, my finances are screwed, and my physical health is going in the wrong direction. And a year later, 40 hours of counseling later, I would love to tell you that it's all fixed. It's not even close. But I can tell you this for sure, that had I not walked into Jim's office that day, I might be divorced, I might be homeless, and I'm almost for sure that I'd be in a mental health hospital. I was so stressed out. So I want to speak to anyone that feels like they don't have that kind of support and community. Maybe they can't walk into Jim's office, though. I think if you call us and tell us that your life is in that place too, that we will help you. That was me a long time ago when I made that first call to Flatirons. Today, you have an awesome first step to take a step towards community. And again, might seem super churchy, might sound like it's what I'm supposed to say to get in a group. It is what I'm supposed to say, but there's a reason, like Ambry said, that we do weekends and we do groups. We believe you learn and hear in a row and you grow in a circle. It's just proven, it's biblical. Life just proves it, that life and support is just better in community, and it's a great avenue to get to rest and to break that cycle if you're stuck there. So please come find myself or any of our staff members afterwards, and we'll help you get connected to a group. And then finally, my third takeaway is this, and it's something that Ben mentioned last week, and I just think it might be the takeaway for every series this week, and I hope that we all really get it. But it's the simple idea that we have to remember that God did not design us to take life on by ourselves. And I'm actually going to let Jim speak to this a little bit, so check out this video from Jim.
Hey everybody, yeah, it's me. I'm alive and doing well. It's crazy that this has been almost 3 months since I started this sabbatical. And I think it's really cool too, is that they said, leadership said, hey, can you just come back and shoot a quick, like, hey, I'm alive video. The interesting part is that Ben just kicked off this series on rest. And last time that we talked, that's one of the things I said is I was just really tired, and part of the sabbatical is going to be about rest. And eventually, it actually turned into rest. But God's just teaching me so much stuff about rest, and I'm not good at it. I've discovered that. Some of the things I'm learning about rest, one is there's a lot of things that compete with it, you know? So here's this has been an emotional roller coaster, as you can imagine, for me. Probably one of the biggest kind of enemies of, I'm gonna speak for myself, but maybe you can relate to this, of rest is, I have a lot of imaginary conversations in my head. And I'm on meds, but that's not what I'm talking about. Meaning, I'm trying to learn to only say the first half of a sentence when I'm in conflict with somebody, right? For example, I'll start with saying things like, okay, I can own this, and I did this wrong, and there's a lot I've done wrong. And God's revealing that to me. And I can get there, and then I turn a corner, and then I say, but, and then I want to start blaming. But what about they did? And what about this? And what about that? And, you know, there may become a time in my life or in your life or in the future where you have to sit down and say, I got to have a hard conversation with you. But that's not today. Today, I'm just trying to look at my stuff and own my stuff. And God is just keeps on going, okay, we'll get to that, but let's look at your own heart too. And that's a new learning for me. Probably the other thing about rest is that it just doesn't come natural. I discovered that I don't know how to be still. This sabbatical, it started really, really abruptly, and I need it. And looking back now, I can own, I wouldn't have done this on my own. And sometimes we have to do some stuff or go through some hard times before we actually pay attention. And that's what the last 2.5 months have been with me. I've got some great elders in my life who we've had so many great conversations where I've said, I own this, and then they say, I own this, and can we make an agreement, and can we move forward? And we're having a lot of great conversations. I love the leaders in my life. I love our staff. I can't wait to be back with them in the future. I want to tell you one story, because I think I only have 5 minutes, which I think in gym language is 8, but whatever. So 2 days after I went on sabbatical, Rob and I flew down to Mexico to meet with James Henderson. James and Aaron are two of our best friends in the world and real spiritual voices in our life, directors in our life. And we actually timed it that we got there when they were hosting a retreat at their house. And I'm like, this is bad timing. And so we were still reeling from everything, and I was really tender. Like I would see a puppy and cry, or just anything just kind of set me off, because either really sad or really tearful or really angry. And we decided to get to James and Aaron's house. It's a Sunday. And we decided to get there and time it so we don't have to go to church. And so they said, well, everybody will be gone by noon. So we timed it and we got there at 10 after 12, just as church was starting. Because it's Mexico City and they just run things different there. And we're like, okay, we came in and sat down. And anytime I'm in another country, in another culture, another language, and the worship starts, it just gets me. It floored Robin. She had to actually go in the house. She was just crying. And because God gets so bigger and so much bigger when you see him in other cultures. But then the teacher was this guy named Daniel. And this is my first sermon in January. So, and I heard Ben taught on my verse, but that's okay, Ben. The teacher gets up and he goes to Matthew 11 and he starts saying, this is what Jesus starts. And I didn't know what came after this. What comes after this is really, really familiar, but he starts by saying, Jesus said this in Matthew 11. He said, what has been hidden from wise people has been revealed to children, and nobody knows the Father except Jesus, the Son, and who Jesus kind of reveals the Father to, which would be us. So anything that comes after that, Jesus is going to say, I want to tell you what God's like. And he says, come unto me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I'll give you rest. Take this yoke upon you, for my burden is light, for I am gentle and humble in heart. And Daniel, the teacher, he said, of all the words that if you put on a list, go and describe God, gentle and humble are not anywhere close. Almighty, powerful, whatever that is. Those are the big ones. But then I started thinking is that I've given God every reason to look at me and be anything but gentle and humble. I mean, he could find somebody better. He could just say, I'm done with you. You should have known better. And his response every time is, come here. Yoke up with me. Walk with me. My response is I want to pay people back. I want to make you feel like I felt. And God has never once done that to me. His response is just come closer, come walk with me and put on this yoke and just, we'll walk this together because that way the burden is actually bearable. And I've been hanging on to that every day. So much so when I got back from Mexico City, I got on eBay and I found this yoke from an Amish family in Indiana from 1850. And I hung it on my porch wall and put that scripture under there. And every morning I try to come out here and just stare at it and be reminded. Because what I want to do a lot of times is take the yoke off and go, do something and then come back and go, okay, Jesus, let's go on. But that's not how God responds to me. And what I'm learning in this sabbatical is I've got to learn to do that with other people. Can you relate to that at all? There's some people in our life, we just want to let them have it and let them know how it feels and pay them back. And that's not what they need from us. What they need is what Jesus has given to us, and that's grace. Come here, come closer, walk with me, and we'll do this together. I hope that this series on rest isn't theoretical, and someday I need to do that. And if you're like me, I hope that God does something in your life that makes you take a look at it, because I wouldn't have paid attention any other way. Hey, let me say this and wrap this up because I'm already over time. Let me answer this question. I got stopped 17 times at a Rockies game and 14 times at a Zach Brown concert. And then Robin's gone to dinner, lunch and breakfast with some ladies in the church. And the question's always the same question. Are you really coming back? I told you I was coming back. I'm coming back, and I'm going to. Here's what I'm gonna do. I just talked to my friend Paul about this. I'm gonna be back. I want to be better and lead as God has entrusted me and charged me to lead. But I've decided I'm gonna fish more, and hunt more, and babysit my grandkids a little bit more. I'm gonna hike more. I haven't gone to church in 3 months, and weekends are awesome. Especially with our online stuff that we have access to. Someone told me, I'd rather be fishing thinking about God than in church think about fishing. And that's philosophy there. But my point is I'm coming back. I was talking again to my friend Paul at Chick-fil-A the other day, and Billy and Sam, you know who you are, you stopped by and you said, are you really coming back? Because we really miss you. Hey, Billy and Sam, and anybody else has that question, I'll be back, I promise. And I miss you, and I can't wait to be back teaching from a really good place of what God's teaching me. I love you, and I will see you very, very soon. Thanks.
I promise I am just as excited to watch that as you guys are. So I want to read that verse again. And it says, "Then Jesus said, 'Come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, let me teach you, because I am humble and gentle at heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy to bear, and the burden I give you is light.'" Man, rest for my soul. Give me some of that. We have to remember that God did not design us to take on life by ourselves, but we have to rest if we're ever really going to believe that. And if this whole thing feels overwhelming to you, I hope you can find solace knowing that Elijah and even Jim also struggled with rest. I don't know if you catch that in the video. I've watched it a couple times, but he says he doesn't know how to be still. And I think a lot of us, burned out or not, we don't know how to be still. So with that in mind, I want to leave you with one thing today, and I want us to all memorize this verse real quick. Some of you already know what's coming, but it's Psalm 46:10, and it simply says, "Be still and know that I am God." So repeat it with me. Be still and know that I am God. You just memorized the verse. Listen, I don't know what you guys are specifically going through, but I trust that God does, that the Holy Spirit does, that God's going to give you exactly like he gave Elijah exactly what he needed. He's given me exactly what I needed, and I think he's going to give you exactly what he needs and what you need to reconnect with him. So over the next few days, over the next few weeks, that's your memorization verse. I think we've all got it down already, but I really just in your quiet time, in that 5 minutes in your drive to work, just say that verse and invite God to come in and give you the rest that you need. And I sincerely believe that he's going to answer that. So we're going to sing 2 more songs. We kind of changed it up to you, on you today, and then we'll get out of here and just spend a little bit more time just reflecting on that as the band sings a couple more killer songs. So thanks for listening to me, and just let's pray together, guys. God, I come to you this morning just with a really full heart. One of my favorite parts about Flatirons, and I'm just thanking you for this, is that we don't just get preached at, that the leaders of this church, they're there in the trenches with us. And I love that you sent a man that said, hey, I'll go first, I'll pause, I'll take inventory of my life, I'll go to counseling, I'll slow down, I'll get my relationships healthy with my family in order that I can connect with you, God, to come back into this craziness of life, to come back into my job and to lead Flatirons and continue to keep this thing going. God, I just ask for everybody in this room, myself included especially, that you would just answer that prayer, that when we say, God, be still and know that I am God, that you're going to answer us, and that we can have trust in that. Just give us that peace, that you're here with us, and that you know the plan, and that you've got everything worked out. We love you very, very much, and we thank you for this place we call Flatirons. Amen.